A billionaire discovers a homeless boy stealing from his house, but when he sees the fear and bruises on the boy's body, rain poured from the heavens with relentless intensity, each drop striking the concrete like a shard of glass. The city, washed in muted grays, stretched endlessly, its streets empty, but for the splashes of puddles beneath Sean's tattered sneakers. He clutched his wrist, where purple bruises bloomed in grotesque patterns, a cruel reminder of the night he fled. His breaths came in jagged gasps, more ragged with each step. The cold air sliced through his threadbare jacket, and hunger gnawed at his stomach with merciless precision. His body wanted to stop, but the sharp image of Roger's face, furrowed brows, clenched jaw, kept him moving. Roger's threats continued to echo in his mind. "You think you can just leave? You'll regret it." The streetlights buzzed weakly, some flickering before fading entirely, as if the city itself conspired to abandon him. Ahead, through the curtain of rain, a mansion loomed. Its sprawling frame was unlike anything Sean had seen outside of a television screen. Tall iron gates, a perfectly manicured garden, and warm light spilling from wide floor-to-ceiling windows. It felt as though it belonged to another world, a parallel reality where warmth and safety existed. Sean stood outside the gates, his heart pounding. Through the window, he caught a glimpse of an immaculate dining table adorned with untouched platters of food. Roast chicken, golden and glistening. A bowl of soup sending wisps of steam into the air. His stomach churned violently, louder than the rain. He bit his lip, uncertainty clawing at him. He didn't belong here. His ragged clothes, matted hair, and dirt-streaked face were all the proof he needed. But hunger dulled everything else. The shame, the fear, even the small voice that whispered, "You'll get caught." He scanned the perimeter, spotting an unlatched gate along the far edge of the property. Sean slipped inside, his movements slow and deliberate, his wet sneakers sinking slightly into the manicured lawn. The garden was pristine, with rows of roses perfectly aligned as if measured by hand. But Sean didn't notice the details. His focus was singular. The kitchen door. The door gave way with a soft creak. He stepped into a dimly lit hallway that smelled of polished wood and something faintly citrus. His soaked clothes left a small trail on the marble floor, but he didn't care. The promise of food, of relief, was just a few steps away. As he moved deeper, he found the pantry. Rows of shelves stretched to the ceiling, stacked with jars, boxes, and cans. His fingers brushed over the smooth labels as he searched for something quick and filling. A loaf of bread caught his eye, wrapped neatly in crisp packaging. He tore into it with shaking hands, stuffing pieces into his mouth so quickly he barely tasted the soft crust. Then the silence shattered. A shrill alarm erupted, cutting through the house like a scream. Sean froze, the bread slipping from his fingers. Bright white light flooded the pantry, blinding him momentarily. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. Footsteps pounded on the polished floors, getting louder with every second. He spun, his breath shallow and quick, his mind racing. No escape. "Who's there?" A voice, deep and commanding, rang out from the hall. Not angry, calm, measured, but with an edge that sent chills down Sean's spine. The light shifted, narrowing into a sharp beam that pinned Sean where he stood. He squinted against its intensity, lifting a trembling arm to shield his face. Through the haze, he saw them. Two large men, dressed in dark uniforms, their hands hovering near the weapons on their belts. "Don't move," one of them barked, his tone sharp but controlled. Sean's back hit the pantry wall. The room seemed to close in, the shelves pressing tighter against him, His breathing accelerated, his chest rising and falling with the intensity of a cornered animal. He thought of Roger again, of the punishment waiting for him if he was sent back. But before he could respond, another figure emerged behind the guards. Taller, older, and exuding a quiet authority, the man stepped forward. His silhouette was striking even in the chaos, the tailored suit, silver-threaded hair, and piercing eyes that locked onto Sean's trembling form. Douglas Harrington tilted his head slightly, as if appraising the boy. Then, after a long moment, he spoke, his voice low and steady. "Stand down," he instructed the guards, his tone brooking no argument. The guards hesitated but obeyed, lowering their hands. The tension in the air didn't dissipate, though. Douglas's gaze didn't waver, pinning Sean in place more effectively than the light had. "And you," he said, his voice calm but firm. "What exactly were you hoping to find here?" Sean's throat felt dry, despite the rain-soaked clothes clinging to his frame. He tried to speak, but the words stuck. He pressed himself harder against the wall, heart pounding in his ears. Douglas's expression softened just a fraction, his eyes narrowing slightly as he noticed something. The boy's wrist, bruised and swollen, the bread on the floor, the sheer terror etched into his face. The silence stretched for a beat longer. Then Douglas sighed and said, almost too quietly, "Bring him to the kitchen." The kitchen was a symphony of muted light and polished surfaces. The warm glow from the chandelier above reflected softly on the marble counters, casting faint shadows that swayed with the flicker of the fireplace in the next room. The storm outside was relentless, the rain hammering against the large glass windows like an angry drumbeat, but inside it was silent, except for the occasional crackle of the hearth. Douglas Harrington stood at the threshold, his sharp eyes fixed on the boy sitting hunched at the far edge of the kitchen table. Sean's soaked clothes clung to him, forming a dark, dripping pool around the chair legs. His thin frame looked frail, almost breakable, against the backdrop of Douglas's expansive, gleaming home. Douglas took a measured step forward, his leather shoes clicking softly on the floor. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice calm, steady. He didn't raise it, didn't demand. He simply asked, as if the boy's answer mattered more than the intrusion itself. Sean didn't respond. His gaze darted around the room, never settling on Douglas, his fingers digging into the edge of the chair. His breathing was shallow, his chest rising and falling, too quickly, akin to a cornered animal. Douglas exhaled through his nose, a small, deliberate sigh that softened the air between them. He gestured subtly to the loaf of bread on the counter. "You must be hungry." No reaction. With slow, deliberate movements, Douglas walked to the stovetop. A pot of soup simmered quietly, steam curling into the air with a savory aroma. He ladled the soup into a wide white bowl and placed it on the table in front of Sean. The boy flinched at the sound of the porcelain meeting the wood. Douglas said, "Eat," in a neutral, almost offhand tone, as if serving food to an uninvited guest was a commonplace occurrence. He pulled out a chair across from Sean and sat down, leaning back slightly, his sharp features illuminated by the soft kitchen light. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, tentatively, Sean reached for the spoon. His fingers, thin and trembling, gripped it as though it might shatter under his touch. He dipped it into the soup and brought it to his lips, his movements deliberate but hesitant, his eyes flickering toward Douglas every few seconds, like he was waiting for the man to snatch the bowl away. Douglas didn't speak. He watched, but not in a way that felt oppressive. His gaze was steady, searching. It wasn't the soup that fascinated him. It was the way Sean ate it. Each cautious sip told a story Douglas didn't need words to understand. "How old are you?" Douglas asked after a while. Sean paused mid-bite, the spoon hovering near his mouth. He didn't answer, only shrugged slightly and returned to eating. "Are you from around here?" Another silence. Sean's eyes darted toward the window, where the rain blurred the outlines of the garden beyond. Douglas leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "You've been running, haven't you?" This time, Sean froze, completely. His hand dropped, causing the spoon to clatter against the bowl, and his body tensed like a spring about to snap. His knuckles whitened as they gripped the edge of the table. Douglas noticed, but he didn't press. Instead, he leaned back, giving the boy space. "I know that look," he said softly, almost to himself. "You think the world's out to get you, that nobody cares, that if you trust someone, they'll let you down." Sean's eyes flickered toward Douglas for the first time, just a brief glance. But it was enough. Douglas caught the fear in them, the kind that wasn't born of the rain or the cold, but of people. Of something or someone Sean couldn't escape. "I'm not here to hurt you," Douglas said evenly. "But I can't help you if you don't let me." Sean's shoulders hunched slightly, his small frame curling inward as though trying to make himself invisible. He stared into the bowl of soup, now half empty, his lips pressed tightly together. Douglas sighed again, his expression unreadable. He hadn't expected answers, not yet. But he could see it in the boy's every movement, in the way his hands shook, in the bruises peeking from under his sleeves. This wasn't just a child who'd wandered in out of the storm. This was a boy who had been running for far too long. "Who are you running from?" Douglas asked, his voice quieter now, almost gentle. Sean didn't look up. His fingers traced the edge of the bowl absently, his lips parting slightly, as though the words were there, perched on the edge, waiting to leap. But they didn't come. Douglas didn't push. Instead, he stood, walking to the counter and picking up a small business card. He placed it on the table beside Sean, the motion deliberate, but without urgency. "If you need help," he said, his tone even, "you know where to find me." He didn't wait for a response. Douglas turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Sean alone with the bowl of soup and the quiet hum of the rain outside. Douglas stirred from a restless sleep. His room was dark, except for the faint silver slivers of moonlight slipping through the heavy drapes. The storm had subsided, leaving behind an eerie stillness that clung to the house. Despite the quiet, Douglas couldn't shake the image of the boy. His hollow eyes, the bruises on his wrist, the way he hunched over his soup like he expected it to vanish. Rising from his bed, he wrapped a robe around himself and padded quietly to his study. The polished mahogany shelves towered above him, lined with rows of neatly arranged books, artifacts, and mementos of a life meticulously built. But tonight, none of it offered comfort. He sank into the leather armchair, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. The boy had not revealed his name, yet his quiet movements and his flinches at every sound conveyed a powerful message. Douglas knew the look of someone carrying more fear than their small frame could bear. It was the same look that had stared back at him in the mirror many years ago. A soft knock broke his thoughts. The sound was hesitant, almost too faint to catch. He turned toward the door, his brow furrowing. "Come in." The door creaked open, revealing Sean standing in the dim hallway. He'd shed his wet clothes for a dry sweater and pants one of Douglas's staff had left for him. They hung loosely on his small frame, the sleeves bunched awkwardly at his wrists. He lingered in the doorway, one hand gripping the doorframe, the other clutching the hem of his sweater. Douglas didn't speak, letting the boy take his time. Finally, Sean stepped inside, his bare feet barely sounding on the carpet. He stopped a few steps from the desk, his gaze fixed on the floor. "My name is Sean," he said, so softly it was almost swallowed by the room. Douglas inclined his head slightly, his expression calm. "It's good to meet you, Sean." Sean hesitated, his mouth opening as if he had more to say, but no words came. Instead, he turned abruptly and left, the door clicking shut behind him. Douglas leaned back in his chair, a faint sigh escaping his lips. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The following morning, Douglas sat at his desk, a steaming cup of coffee beside him. The house was quiet, save for the occasional distant hum of a vacuum or the soft shuffle of footsteps from the staff. His phone buzzed, its screen lighting up with a familiar name. He picked it up and answered. "Scott," he greeted, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. "I need you to look into someone for me." "Of course, sir. Who?" Scott Mercer's tone was crisp, efficient, the voice of someone who knew how to get things done. A boy, roughly 11 or 12 years old. Brown hair, small frame, bruises on his wrists, and likely malnourished. "He showed up at my house last night." Scott remained unfazed. "Do you have a name?" "Sean. That's all I've got." "Any idea where he might have come from? Foster system? Missing persons?" Douglas's jaw tightened. "He's running from something, or someone. Check the foster care databases first. If there's a report, I want to know." "Understood. I'll get back to you as soon as I have something." Douglas ended the call, setting the phone down with a deliberate motion. He glanced toward the window, where the garden glistened under the morning sun, the rain-soaked grass shimmering like tiny jewels. Somewhere out there, Sean had lived through enough pain to drive him to Douglas's doorstep, and Douglas intended to find out why. Sean spent the day wandering the house, though wandering seemed too generous a word. His movements were cautious and deliberate, as if each step required calculation. He paused in the hallways, eyes lingering on the ornate paintings and sculptures, his hands tucked tightly into the sleeves of his borrowed sweater. The staff watched him with quiet curiosity, their whispers barely audible over the hum of the house. But Sean didn't speak, not to them, not even to Douglas, who occasionally caught glimpses of him disappearing around corners. By evening, Scott called back. Douglas answered on the first ring. "I've got something," Scott said, his voice brisk. "A missing persons report filed 2 days ago. Sean Ellis, age 11, last seen leaving the home of Roger and Karen Ellis, foster parents." Douglas's grip on the phone tightened. "What else?" "The report says Sean's a troubled kid, ran away after an argument. But here's the thing. The Ellis have fostered 12 kids in the past decade. None of them stayed longer than a year. Their financial records? Let's just say the money isn't going toward the kids." Douglas's jaw clenched. He stared out the window, his reflection hard against the backdrop of a clearing sky. "Dig deeper." "I want to know everything." "On it," Scott replied. As the call ended, Douglas placed the phone down and leaned against the desk. His gaze lingered on the garden below, the raindrops clinging to the petals of roses that swayed gently in the breeze. Sean's face flashed in his mind, hollow, guarded, waiting for the next blow. Douglas straightened, his expression hardening. Whatever secrets the boy was hiding, he'd find them. And whatever the Ellis had done, they'd pay for it. Douglas stared at the morning light filtering through his study windows, golden rays cutting through the haze left by the storm. The roses in the garden glistened, delicate and untouched, a sharp contrast to the weight of the information Scott had uncovered. Roger and Karen Ellis. The names lingered bitterly in his thoughts, an ugly thread weaving into Sean's already fragile existence. Over a dozen foster children, Scott had said during their last call. 12 kids in 10 years, none staying longer than a year. It doesn't look good. Douglas replayed the conversation in his mind. Government records detailed the funds Roger and Karen received for fostering, large sums that seemed to vanish into personal expenses, luxury items, frequent withdrawals, and lavish vacations. There were whispers of complaints filed, vague accusations of neglect and abuse, but nothing conclusive. The system had failed Sean, just as it had failed so many others. His fingers drummed lightly against the desk, the rhythm steady, despite the anger simmering beneath his composed exterior. Douglas knew fury. He knew how it consumed, how it clouded judgment. But he'd learned long ago to channel it into something sharper, something that could cut through the layers of deceit shielding people like the Ellis. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," Douglas called. The door opened slowly, and Sean peeked in, his face partially obscured by the oversized sweater he wore. He stepped inside, his movements careful, as though expecting the floor to give way beneath him. His gaze darted between Douglas and the papers scattered across the desk. "Are you busy?" Sean's voice was hesitant, barely a whisper. Douglas leaned back in his chair, gesturing toward the empty seat across from him. "Not too busy for you. Come sit." Sean obeyed, though his body remained stiff as he perched on the edge of the chair. His eyes flicked toward the documents on the desk, pages of financial records, highlighted lines, and printouts of reports. "Is that about me?" he asked, his voice faltering. Douglas didn't answer immediately. Instead, he folded his hands, his expression measured. "Some of it," he admitted. "I've been trying to understand what happened to you, to make sure it doesn't happen again." Sean's head dipped, his shoulders curling inward, his hands twisted in his lap, fingers tugging at the frayed hem of his sweater. "I don't want to go back," he muttered, barely audible. "They're not good to me." The words hung in the air, fragile but heavy. Douglas didn't press, letting Sean's admission settle. He could see the boy wrestling with the weight of what he'd revealed, the battle between fear and the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, this time, someone would listen. "They won't hurt you anymore," Douglas said firmly, his voice low but resolute. "I'll make sure of it." Sean glanced up, his eyes wide and uncertain. For a moment, he seemed poised to argue, to push back against the promise. But something in Douglas's steady gaze softened the resistance in him. He looked down again, nodding faintly. Douglas leaned forward slightly, his tone gentle but probing. "Can you tell me more? About them? About what happened?" Sean flinched, his hands balling into fists. "They act nice when people are watching," he said slowly, each word forced out like it hurt to say. "But when it's just us, they yell. They hit sometimes. Not just me, the others too." Douglas's chest tightened, his jaw clenching momentarily before he forced himself to stay calm. "The others?" he asked carefully. Sean nodded, his voice trembling. "Kids that came before me. They didn't stay long. Some left at night, like I did. I don't know where they went." Douglas inhaled deeply, steadying himself. Every instinct urged him to take action, but he was wise enough to avoid haste. He needed to be deliberate, methodical, for Sean's sake. "Sean," he began softly, "thank you for telling me. I know it's not easy, but the more I understand, the better I can help." Sean's gaze flicked toward him, searching his face, as though testing the sincerity in his words. "You're not like them," the boy said quietly, almost to himself. Douglas's expression softened, though his resolve hardened. "No, Sean," he said firmly. "I'm not." Later that afternoon, Douglas's phone buzzed again. Scott's voice came through, sharp and focused. "It's worse than I thought," he began. "The Ellis are pocketing the majority of the foster care funds, and the complaints. They've been buried, likely because Roger has connections in the local welfare office." Douglas's grip tightened on the phone. Anything else? Scott hesitated. There's a pattern. Kids vanish from their records after leaving the system. No follow-ups, no trace. Douglas's free hand curled into a fist. He didn't need to speak for Scott to know the rage boiling under his silence. I'll dig deeper, Scott promised. There's more here. I'll find it. Douglas ended the call and leaned against the desk, staring out at the garden again. The roses swayed gently in the breeze, but their thorns glinted in the light. He thought of Sean's quiet resilience, his hollow voice, and the bruises he'd carried like shadows. The Ellis thought they could hide behind bureaucracy and complacency. Douglas knew better. They weren't untouchable, and they wouldn't escape justice. Not this time. Douglas sat at the head of the long oak conference table in his study, his posture rigid yet composed. The room was a sanctuary of polished wood and soft lighting, filled with an air of determination. Across from him sat Scott Mercer, his trusted assistant, and Miss Benson, a former teacher and one of Douglas's closest allies in advocating for vulnerable children. Sean lingered by the door, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his gaze flickering between the adults like he was measuring their trustworthiness. Douglas's tone was deliberate, his words sharp with purpose. We have enough to know that Roger and Karen Ellis are exploiting the system, but it's not enough to bring them down. We need direct evidence, something indisputable. Scott leaned forward, his tablet glowing faintly in his hands. I've traced more transactions. Their spending patterns are blatant, but they've buried the trail just enough to stay under the radar. It's going to take time to tie everything together. Time isn't a luxury we have, Douglas said. His eyes flicked to Sean, who shrank slightly under the weight of the attention. Miss Benson, her voice calm but firm, interjected. And the other children? If this is their pattern, those kids might be in immediate danger. Douglas nodded, his jaw tightening. That's why we need to act now. Sean, he turned toward the boy, softening his voice. I need your help. Sean froze, his fingers curling around the hem of his oversized sweater. Me. His voice wavered, the single syllable heavy with apprehension. Douglas gestured to the small black recorder sitting on the table. Its sleek surface reflected the light, deceptively simple for the burden it carried. If we're going to stop them, we need proof of what they're doing when no one else is looking. I need you to record them. Sean stared at the device, his expression unreadable, his shoulders hunched further, his body language screaming reluctance. What if they find out? Douglas didn't flinch. He leaned forward, his voice steady and reassuring. They won't. You'll keep it hidden. But if they do, he hesitated, his eyes locking with Sean's. If they do, you call me. I'll get to you, no matter what. Sean's breathing quickened, his fingers tightening around the fabric of his sweater. The room seemed to stifle its breath as the boy grappled with the fear that gnawed at him. At last, he raised his gaze, his voice barely rising above a murmur. What if it doesn't work? Douglas held his gaze, his tone firm, but not unkind. Then we'll try something else. But this is a step we need to take. Sean glanced at Scott and Miss Benson, their quiet expressions of support offering a small measure of comfort. He swallowed hard, nodding slowly. Okay. Douglas slid the recorder toward him. It's small enough to hide. Keep it in your shoe. They won't think to check there. Sean hesitated before picking it up, holding it like it was something fragile. His hands trembled slightly, and Douglas's sharp eyes didn't miss the way he gripped it tighter, as if grounding himself. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting a golden glow over the sprawling garden as Douglas walked Sean to the edge of the estate. The boy's steps were hesitant, his worn sneakers scuffing the gravel path. The recorder was tucked securely in his shoe, a small weight that felt heavier with every step. "You don't have to do this," Douglas said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was low, but it carried an edge of sincerity. "If you're not ready, we'll find another way." Sean stopped, his gaze fixed on the ground. For a moment it seemed like he might turn back. But then he looked up, meeting Douglas's eyes with a resolve that hadn't been there before. "I don't want anyone else to go through what I did." Douglas's chest tightened, a quiet pride stirring beneath the frustration and anger that had driven him for days. "You're braver than you realize, Sean." The boy remained silent, yet his slight nod conveyed a powerful message. His small frame seemed to shrink under the shadow of the towering iron bars. Douglas watched him disappear down the street, his small figure swallowed by the golden haze of dusk. The air grew heavier, the stakes seemingly unachievable. Sean's footsteps echoed faintly as he approached the Ellis's house, the looming silhouette of the familiar structure sending a shiver down his spine. As he reached for the door, his heart pounded, the recorder in his shoe a constant reminder of the danger he was stepping into. The door creaked open, and the cold, oppressive air of the house greeted him like an old enemy. He was in the lion's den now. Sean hesitated at the doorstep of the Ellis's house, the chill from the damp evening air creeping into his bones. The structure loomed before him, its peeling paint and dimly lit windows radiating a sense of hostility. His hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob, the faint weight of the recorder in his shoe reminding him of what he had to do. The door swung open before he could knock. Roger's large frame filled the doorway, his eyes narrowing at the sight of Sean. A slow, mocking grin spread across his face. "Well, well," Roger sneered, his voice thick with contempt. "The little rat finally found his way home. Miss the warm bed, did you?" Sean lowered his gaze, gripping the straps of his too large backpack to steady his shaking hands. He didn't respond. The man's words clawed at him, but he swallowed his fear, stepping past Roger and into the dimly lit hallway. The air inside was stagnant, heavy with an unspoken tension. Karen sat in the living room, her sharp eyes glancing up from the magazine she was pretending to read. She offered a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You've got some nerve, running off like that." Sean didn't stop. He made his way to the small corner of the house that passed for his room, a makeshift space barely big enough for the worn mattress it held. He set down his backpack, his fingers brushing the recorder in his shoe as he adjusted it discreetly. Dinner was a quiet ordeal at the Ellis's house, at least on the surface. The clink of utensils against cheap porcelain filled the room, accompanied by the faint hum of an old ceiling fan. Roger sat at the head of the table, his sharp eyes darting between Sean and Karen, as though searching for something to correct. Karen moved mechanically, her gaze fixed on her plate, barely touching her food. Sean sat silently, his movements calculated and small. His mind raced, every second stretching longer than the last. The recorder pressed against the sole of his foot, snug inside his shoe, a weight both physical and mental. He felt the sweat on his palms and the tightness in his chest. He needed to act. The opportunity wouldn't last forever. His hand reached for his glass of water, fingers trembling. He didn't need to fake it. His nerves were already frayed. As he raised it to his lips, it slipped from his grasp. The glass hit the table, toppled, and spilled water everywhere. Roger's reaction was instantaneous. The sharp scrape of his chair against the floor sent a jolt through Sean. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Roger's voice was venomous, rising above the droning fan. "I'm sorry," Sean stammered, his voice small. His heart pounded so loudly he thought it might drown out the shouting. "Sorry?" Roger barked, standing now, looming over Sean. The shadow of the man appeared to engulf the boy completely. "That's all you ever say. Sorry this, sorry that, you're nothing but a waste of space." Karen flinched, but didn't speak, her eyes fixed on her plate. Her silence was louder than Roger's tirade, a complicity that twisted the air in the room into something suffocating. Roger's voice dropped to a hiss, sharp and cutting. "You're just a piece of property. Do you hear me? Something the state pays me to tolerate." Sean froze, the words sinking into him like barbs. He kept his head down, his face obscured, but his heart surged with a small flicker of hope. The recorder was capturing every word. Roger's hand twitched, his fist clenching, as though he was deciding whether to escalate further. Instead, he sneered and turned away, muttering under his breath as he grabbed a towel to mop up the spilled water. "Clean this up," he barked at Sean, tossing the towel toward him. Sean caught it with shaky hands, nodding silently as he bent to wipe the table. The moment passed, but the tension lingered, thick and oppressive. Roger returned to his seat, grumbling, while Karen pushed her food around her plate, still saying nothing. Sean's mind raced. He had the recording, he just needed to make it out. Later that night, the air outside felt sharp and biting as Sean crept out of the house. His footsteps were quick but cautious, the fear of being caught propelling him forward. The recorder was still tucked in his shoe, but the weight felt different now, less burdensome, more hopeful. When he reached Douglas's estate, the gates opened with a low groan. Douglas was waiting just beyond them, his silhouette imposing yet steady in the dim light of the garden lamps. Sean ran toward him, his breaths coming in short gasps as relief mingled with exhaustion. Douglas crouched slightly to meet him. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice firm but not harsh. Sean nodded, pulling off his shoe and retrieving the small recorder. He handed it to Douglas, his hands shaking. "I understand," he whispered. Douglas took the device carefully, his expression unreadable. He straightened, looking at Scott, who stood nearby. "We'll go through this immediately," Douglas said. "Sean, go inside. Miss Benson will help you get settled." Sean hesitated, glancing between Douglas and the recorder. Did I do okay?" Douglas looked down at him, his expression softening. "You did more than okay. You did what most adults wouldn't have the courage to do." Sean's shoulders loosened slightly, and he nodded before heading toward the house. Hours later, Douglas and Scott sat in the study, the faint glow of the recorder's playback illuminating their tense expressions. Roger's voice filled the room, venomous and raw. "You're just a piece of property." Douglas's jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of his desk. Beneath his composed exterior, a simmering anger simmered, a quiet storm threatening to break out. Scott paused the playback. "This is damning," he said, "but it might not be enough. They'll argue it's circumstantial, that it doesn't prove physical harm." Douglas's voice was low, controlled. "It's a start. If the authorities won't act on this..." He glanced at the recorder, then at Scott. "Then we'll take it to the public. If they won't listen, we'll make the world hear us." Scott nodded, already reaching for his phone to begin coordinating their next steps. Douglas stared out the window into the dark night, his mind racing. Sean had taken the first step, but the battle was far from over. The Ellis might have the system on their side, but Douglas had something stronger, a boy's courage and the unwavering determination to bring justice. What day of the week did this story come to you? Leave a comment below and hope it makes you feel better. The headline on the front page of the city's most prominent newspaper was impossible to miss. A broken system, the hidden horror of foster care. Beneath it, a photograph of a small recorder sat against a stark black background, a caption below reading, "Evidence that speaks for itself." Douglas stared at the paper in his study, the article's bold text demanding attention. It outlined the Ellis's financial exploitation of the foster care system, detailed the testimonies from other foster children who'd come forward after reading the initial report, and prominently featured excerpts from the recording. Roger's venomous words echoed in the print. "You're just a piece of property." Public outrage was immediate. Within hours of publication, the story dominated news feeds and television broadcasts. Social media erupted with hashtags calling for justice. The article resonated not only with Sean's case, but also with its symbolic representation of a systemic failure to protect the most vulnerable. Douglas's name became synonymous with the crusade, but he redirected every question back to Sean's story and the countless others like it. At the Ellis's house, the atmosphere was suffocating. Roger paced the living room, his movements sharp and erratic. He gripped the newspaper tightly, his knuckles white. The headline seemed to glare at him from the page. "This is slander," he hissed, throwing the paper onto the coffee table. "They're painting us like monsters, like criminals." Karen sat stiffly on the worn couch, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, but her eyes darted nervously toward the window. The curtains were drawn, but she could almost feel the weight of the outside world pressing in. "Maybe we should stay quiet," she murmured, her voice shaky. "Let it blow over." "Quiet?" Roger barked, his face reddening. "You think this will just blow over? They're dragging our names through the mud. This Douglas Harrington thinks he can come after us. I'll destroy him." Karen flinched at his tone, her fingers twisting together. What if someone listens to the recording? What if they believe it? Roger turned sharply, his glare piercing. "Nobody's going to believe some runaway kid over us. They don't know him like we do. We'll make them see he's nothing but a troublemaker, a liar." His confidence faltered for just a moment, his jaw tightening as if forcing himself to believe his own words. He stormed out of the room, leaving Karen alone with her quiet panic. At Douglas's estate, Sean sat at the edge of the garden, his gaze fixed on the roses swaying gently in the breeze. The sunlight painted the petals in soft hues of pink and red, but Sean's thoughts were far from the tranquil scene before him. He had seen the article that morning. Douglas had shown it to him over breakfast, his voice steady as he explained what they had done. Sean had read the words slowly, his hands gripping the edge of the table as Roger's voice echoed in his mind again. "You're nothing but a waste of space." Now, sitting in the garden, he replayed the scene in his mind. But this time, something shifted. Roger's words didn't seem as overwhelming. The weight of them had begun to lift, replaced by something unfamiliar, a sense of pride. For the first time, Sean felt like he had a voice, and it mattered. Douglas's voice cut through his thoughts. "Mind some company?" he asked, approaching with measured steps. Sean shook his head, gesturing toward the spot beside him. Douglas sat down, his posture relaxed, but his gaze sharp, studying the boy carefully. "You've seen the reactions, haven't you?" Douglas asked. Sean nodded. "People are angry." "They should be," Douglas said simply. "What you did, what you shared, has made them see something they've ignored for too long." Sean looked down at his hands. "I was scared," he admitted. "I still am." Douglas placed a hand on Sean's shoulder, firm but reassuring. "Courage isn't about not being scared. It's about doing what's right, even when you are." Sean looked up at him, his brow furrowed. "Do you think it'll change anything? Or will it just go away?" Douglas's expression softened, but there was steel beneath his words. "It's already changing things. Look at what you've done. You've given others the courage to speak out. That's the start of something bigger." Douglas's phone rang constantly. Journalists, activists, even lawmakers wanting to discuss reform. Roger and Karen tried to fight back. They issued a public statement, denying all allegations and painting themselves as victims of a smear campaign. Roger's voice was calm and rehearsed as he addressed the cameras. "We've done nothing but care for the children placed in our home. These accusations are baseless." But their performance cracked under scrutiny. Subtle moments, a flicker of panic in Roger's eyes, the nervous way Karen twisted her wedding ring, revealed the truth they were desperate to hide. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sean sat with Douglas and Scott in the study. The room buzzed with energy, plans forming and momentum building. Sean listened carefully, his heart swelling with something he hadn't felt in years: hope. At one point, Scott glanced at him, his tone light but sincere. "You know, kid, you're braver than most adults I've met." Sean flushed, ducking his head, but a small smile crept onto his face. He didn't feel brave, but he was beginning to believe he could be. Douglas watched him for a moment before speaking. "This isn't just about exposing the Ellis," he said. "It's about fixing the system that let them get away with it. And you're the reason we've come this far, Sean." Sean met Douglas's gaze, his voice quiet but steady. "Then let's make sure they can't do it again." The soft hum of Douglas's study lamp cast a warm glow over the cluttered desk, its surface covered with legal documents, transcripts, and highlighted notes. Sean sat in the corner, his legs tucked under the oversized chair, his small frame nearly swallowed by its plush fabric. His fingers played nervously with the frayed hem of his sweater as the voices of Douglas and his legal team filled the room. "This recording will be pivotal," said Miss Benson, her tone sharp as she pointed to the transcription of Roger's tirade. "But we need more than this to ensure a conviction. Financial records, testimonies, patterns of abuse, everything must be airtight." Douglas nodded, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "We have laid the foundation, yet they will engage in a fierce battle. Roger will spin the narrative, and Karen will play the victim. We need to anticipate every move." Sean's stomach churned at the mention of their names. He stared at the papers in Douglas's hands, feeling the weight of his role in the case pressing down on him. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every child the Ellis had hurt, and every child who might still be at risk. "Sean," Douglas said gently, breaking through the boy's thoughts, "do you feel ready to testify?" The room fell silent. All eyes turned to him, and Sean's fingers stilled. He looked up, meeting Douglas's gaze. What if they don't believe me?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "They'll believe you," Miss Benson said firmly, leaning forward. "Your courage brought us this far, Sean. The truth is on your side." Douglas nodded. "She's right. But I know it's not easy. Facing Roger, it takes a kind of strength most adults don't have." Sean's throat tightened. He thought of Roger's voice, sharp and venomous, echoing in his mind, the way his shadow had loomed over him, suffocating. Could he really stand up to that man in a courtroom full of strangers? Douglas seemed to sense his hesitation. He sat back, his expression softening. "You know," he began, his voice quieter now, "when I was about your age, I had to face someone who hurt me. Someone who made me feel small and powerless. I was terrified." Sean blinked, his attention sharpening. Douglas rarely spoke about his past. "What happened?" he asked. Douglas's gaze drifted toward the window, the glow of the garden lights reflecting in his eyes. "I told the truth. It wasn't easy. I stammered over my words and felt like running the entire time. But in the end, telling the truth gave me something no one could take away. My freedom." Sean absorbed Douglas's words, his chest tightening with a mix of fear and admiration. "Were they punished?" he asked. Douglas's lips pressed into a thin line. "Not as much as they should have been, but enough for me to move on, and enough for me to promise myself that if I ever saw someone else in that position, I'd do whatever it took to help them." The room was quiet for a moment. Then Sean nodded, a small but firm motion. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steadier now. "I'll testify." The days leading up to the trial were filled with intense preparation. Miss Benson worked tirelessly with the legal team, organizing every piece of evidence: Roger's financial records, the testimonies of former foster children, and the damning recording Sean had risked so much to capture. Each piece came together seamlessly, revealing the Ellises' blatant greed and cruelty. Sean spent hours with Miss Benson and Douglas, practicing his testimony. They walked him through every question he might face, preparing him for the defense's attempts to discredit him. "Stick to the truth," Miss Benson reminded him. "No matter how much they push you, the truth is your anchor." Douglas stayed close, offering quiet reassurances when Sean's nerves threatened to overwhelm him. "You're not alone in this," he said more than once. "We're with you every step of the way." The night before the trial, Sean sat in his room, staring at the suit Douglas had laid out for him. It was simple, but neat, the fabric crisp and clean. He ran his fingers over the collar, imagining himself wearing it in the courtroom, standing in front of the judge, Roger, and an audience of strangers. The fear was still there, coiled tightly in his chest, but so was something else, a small, flickering strength he hadn't felt before. A knock at the door drew his attention. Douglas stepped inside, his expression calm but serious. "How are you holding up?" he asked. Sean shrugged. "Nervous." Douglas sat on the edge of the bed, nodding. "That's okay. Nerves mean you care about what you're doing. And what you're doing, Sean. It matters. More than you know." Sean looked up at him. "What if I mess up?" Douglas smiled faintly. "You won't. But even if you stumble, remember, the truth doesn't change. You've already done the hardest part by speaking up." Sean nodded slowly, his fingers gripping the edge of the bed. "I'll try." Douglas stood, placing a reassuring hand on Sean's shoulder. "That's all anyone can ask. And for what it's worth, I'm proud of you." The next morning, the courthouse loomed before them, its imposing structure casting long shadows in the early light. Sean took a deep breath, his hands clenched at his sides. Douglas stood beside him, steady as a rock. "Ready?" Douglas asked. Sean nodded, his voice quiet but firm. "Ready?" The courtroom buzzed with an undercurrent of tension, every seat filled with reporters, activists and spectators, drawn by the explosive case against the Ellis. Sean stood just inside the doorway, his suit crisp but slightly too big on his small frame. The hum of conversations seemed to grow louder in his ears, and he clenched his hands tightly, willing himself to breathe steadily. Douglas stood beside him, a quiet but immovable presence. Roger and Karen sat at the defense table. Roger exuded smug confidence, his posture relaxed as if he were attending a business meeting. His eyes flickered toward the audience with a faint smirk, as though the crowd's outrage amused him. Karen, in contrast, wore an expression of carefully crafted remorse, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes darting nervously around the room. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The trial was called to order, and the opening arguments began. The prosecution, led by a sharp-eyed attorney named Ms. Carter, laid out a clear and damning narrative. The Ellis had exploited the foster care system for financial gain, neglected the children under their care, and, in Sean's case, subjected him to verbal and physical abuse. As Ms. Carter spoke, she occasionally gestured to Sean, who sat quietly with Douglas in the front row. Each mention of his name felt like a spotlight shining on him, but he straightened his back, his resolve slowly hardening. Roger's lawyer presented a very different picture during the defense. "My clients," he began smoothly, "have spent over a decade providing care for children in need. They have been accused by one troubled child whose history of running away and lying to authorities raises serious doubts about his credibility. Sean's stomach twisted as the lawyer continued, describing him as unstable and manipulative. The words stung, but he glanced at Douglas, who gave him a reassuring nod. "The truth doesn't change," Douglas's voice echoed in his mind. When it was time for Sean to testify, the air in the courtroom seemed to tighten. The boy stood slowly, his small frame dwarfed by the imposing witness stand. As he climbed into the seat, his hands trembled slightly, but he gripped the edge of the stand to steady himself. Miss Carter approached him with a kind but firm demeanor. "Sean, can you tell the court why you're here today?" He swallowed hard, his voice shaky at first, but gaining strength as he spoke. I'm here because Roger and Karen Ellis hurt me, and I don't want them to hurt anyone else." The courtroom was silent, the weight of his words settling over the crowd. Miss Carter nodded encouragingly. "Can you tell us what happened while you lived with them?" Sean's voice wavered, but he pushed through, recounting the verbal abuse, the isolation, and the physical intimidation. "Roger, he always said I was just a piece of property, that they only kept me because the state paid them to." A faint murmur rippled through the courtroom, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. Ms. Carter stepped back and pressed play on the recorder. The room filled with Roger's venomous voice. "You're just a piece of property." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Sean kept his gaze fixed on the desk in front of him, but he felt the shift in the room. People weren't doubting him anymore. They were believing him. When it was the defense's turn, Roger's lawyer rose, his expression calm but calculated. He approached Sean with measured steps, his tone almost patronizing. "Sean, you've admitted to running away from the Ellis's home before, correct?" Sean nodded. "Yes. And you've been placed with other foster families in the past, haven't you?" "Yes," Sean said, his voice smaller now. The lawyer leaned closer, his tone sharpening. "So, isn't it possible that the Ellis's version of events is true, that you're simply a troubled child looking for attention?" Sean's chest tightened. He glanced at Douglas, who gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. Gathering his courage, Sean took a deep breath and met the lawyer's gaze. "I'm not lying," he said firmly. "You heard what Roger said. You can ask the other kids who lived there. They'll tell you the same thing." The lawyer hesitated for a fraction of a second, thrown off by the boy's quiet strength. He regrouped quickly, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Roger, called to the stand, leaned into his confident persona, portraying himself as a misunderstood caregiver. "These accusations are baseless," he said smoothly. "Sean is a troubled boy, with a history of lying. My wife and I have done nothing but try to help him." But as he spoke, his composure cracked. Under cross-examination, Ms. Carter presented the financial records, the testimonies of former foster children, and Roger's own words from the recording. His attempts to spin the narrative grew more frantic, his smug demeanor giving way to visible frustration. Karen, when called, played the role of the remorseful but passive wife. She claimed ignorance of the financial manipulation and downplayed the abuse. But her nervous fidgeting and inconsistent answers under questioning painted a damning picture of complicity. By the end of the day, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Sean sat beside Douglas, exhausted but resolute. He had faced Roger, told his story, and refused to be silenced. Douglas leaned over, his voice low but steady. "You did everything you needed to do, Sean. The truth is out there now." Sean nodded, a small but determined smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. For the first time in years, he felt something he thought he'd lost forever: hope. As the court adjourned for the day, the murmurs of the crowd swirled around them. The trial wasn't over, but the tide was shifting. And Sean knew, deep down, that he wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for every child who deserved to be heard. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that feels almost tangible, as if the air itself were holding its breath. Sean sat beside Douglas at the plaintiff's table, his hands clasped tightly together. The judge's gavel rested on the bench, a symbol of finality that loomed over the room. Roger sat at the defense table, his once confident demeanor reduced to a mask of barely concealed panic. His fingers tapped nervously against the wood, his eyes darting toward the jury. Karen sat beside him, her face pale and drawn, her hands trembling in her lap. The verdict was moments away. The judge entered, and everyone rose. As the courtroom settled again, the foreperson of the jury stood, holding the small folded piece of paper that would determine the Ellis's fate. Sean's heart thudded in his chest, each beat loud and deliberate, like a countdown. The judge's voice broke the tension. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor," the foreperson replied, her voice steady. She unfolded the paper, glancing briefly at its contents before speaking. "In the case of the State vs. Roger and Karen Ellis, we find the defendant, Roger Ellis, guilty on all counts of abuse, financial fraud, and endangerment of a minor. We recommend a sentence of 25 years in prison." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, followed by murmurs of approval. Roger's shoulders slumped, the weight of the verdict sinking into him. Karen flinched as the foreperson continued. "We find the defendant, Karen Ellis, guilty of complicity and neglect, with a recommended sentence of 10 years in prison." Sean exhaled sharply, relief washing over him in waves. He turned to Douglas, who placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It's over," Douglas said softly, though his eyes held the quiet determination of a man who knew the fight for justice was never truly finished. The judge's gavel struck, signaling the end of the trial. Reporters surged toward the front of the room, their cameras flashing as they called out for statements. Douglas rose, shielding Sean with his presence as they made their way out. The courtroom's heavy doors opened to reveal a sea of people outside, supporters, advocates, and former foster children who had followed the case closely. Cheers erupted as Douglas and Sean stepped into the sunlight. A woman approached them, holding the hand of a boy no older than 7. Her voice trembled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her eyes brimming with tears, "for giving my son a chance to be heard." Douglas nodded, his expression warm but resolute. "This isn't just about one case. It's about making sure no child has to go through this again." In the weeks that followed, the impact of the trial reverberated far beyond the courthouse. News outlets continued to cover the case, sparking national outrage and a renewed focus on reforming the foster care system. Lawmakers introduced legislation aimed at increasing oversight and accountability, while non-profits reported an influx of support from donors and volunteers. Douglas, already known for his philanthropic work, became a leading voice in the movement. Interviews, panels, and meetings filled his schedule, but he always made time for Sean, ensuring the boy understood that his courage had been the catalyst for change. Sean too began to find his footing. With Douglas's support, he started attending therapy sessions, slowly unpacking the trauma he had carried for so long. His days became filled with small Douglases, laughing for the first time in years, trusting others, and even helping Douglas with new initiatives to support foster children. On the day Roger and Karen were officially transferred to prison, Sean and Douglas stood in the garden of Douglas's estate. The roses were in full bloom, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the gray skies that threatened rain. Sean stared at the flowers, his thoughts distant. "Do you think they'll ever feel sorry for what they did?" he asked quietly. Douglas considered the question, his gaze thoughtful. "Maybe, but whether they do or not doesn't change what's important. You stood up to them. You told the truth, and because of that, they can't hurt anyone else." Sean nodded, the weight of Douglas's words settling over him. He reached out and plucked a single rose, holding it carefully by the stem. "I feel lighter," he admitted. "Like I'm not carrying so much anymore." Douglas smiled, placing a hand on Sean's shoulder. "That's because you're not. You've let it go, and now you're free to move forward." Sean looked up at him, a faint but genuine smile breaking across his face. For the first time, the future didn't feel like something to fear. It felt like a promise. As they walked back toward the house hand in hand, the first drops of rain began to fall. Sean glanced up at the sky, feeling the cool droplets on his face. "Do you think we'll ever have to do something like this again?" he asked. Douglas squeezed his hand gently. "Probably, but we'll do it together." The morning light streamed softly through the wide windows of Douglas's estate, casting warm golden hues on the freshly painted walls of Sean's new bedroom. The room was his, a space crafted with care and intention. Posters of his favorite animals adorned one wall, while bookshelves filled with stories he had only begun to explore lined another. On the desk sat a small framed photograph of Sean and Douglas, taken just a week earlier. In it, Sean wore a hesitant smile, but one that hinted at something deeper: hope. Sean stood in the center of the room, holding a box of trinkets Douglas had gifted him, a baseball glove, a journal, and a small wooden figure of a wolf. Each item felt like a step forward, a piece of a life he was finally beginning to build. He set the box down and turned to Douglas, who leaned casually against the doorframe, a cup of coffee in hand. "You sure you're okay with all this?" Sean asked, his voice still carrying traces of uncertainty. Douglas smiled, stepping into the room. "I wouldn't have gone through the paperwork if I wasn't," he said, his tone light but firm. "This is your home now, Sean. Permanently." The words settled over Sean like a warm blanket. He nodded, unable to fully express the emotions bubbling inside him. Instead, he turned back to the room and began unpacking the box, placing the journal neatly on the desk and the wolf figure on the shelf beside his bed. Later that day, the two of them sat in the kitchen, the aroma of freshly baked cookies wafting through the air. Douglas had insisted on baking to celebrate, though Sean found his attempts at measuring flour amusingly chaotic. "You're not exactly a professional, are you?" Sean teased, laughing as Douglas fumbled with the mixing bowl. Douglas chuckled, wiping flour off his hands. "Let's just say I have other talents," he replied. It was a simple moment, but one that felt monumental to Sean. Laughter was no longer a rarity. It was becoming a part of his everyday life. As evening fell, Douglas and Sean found themselves sitting by the large window in the study. The sprawling garden outside was bathed in the soft glow of twilight. Sean leaned against the sill, his eyes following the paths of fireflies that danced through the roses. "Douglas," Sean began, his tone serious, "do you think we can help other kids? Like me?" Douglas looked at him, his expression thoughtful. "I think we already have," he said. "But there's always more to do. We've started a foundation to support kids in the foster system. You'll be a big part of it." Sean's eyes widened. "Me? What can I do?" "You can tell your story," Douglas said gently. "You can show them that things can get better, that they're not alone." Sean nodded slowly, the idea settling in his mind. "I think I'd like that," he said quietly. Douglas placed a hand on Sean's shoulder, the connection between them stronger than words could convey. "Then we'll do it together," he said. They sat in silence for a while, watching the last rays of sunlight fade into the horizon. For Sean, the future no longer felt like a dark void, but a canvas waiting to be filled. As the stars began to emerge, Douglas broke the silence. "Ready for tomorrow?" Sean turned to him, a small smile playing on his lips. "Yeah, I think I am." Douglas smiled back. "Good. because the best part of the journey is just beginning. Together, they gazed out at the night sky, their reflections in the glass framed by the light of the stars. It was a new beginning, not just for Sean, but for the countless lives they would touch. And for the first time, Sean felt truly at home. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.